Beware the Ides of March. This is Douglas Kirk. I am sitting here about to lay out what I consider to be one of the more plausible theories as to why we are now engaged in World War III. What I'm referring to is the coronavirus, or COVID-19 as they like to call it, and the fact that the Chinese are now saying that they believe that the United States was involved in the release of the virus. I'm going to spell out what I think is the reasoning behind that statement from the Chinese, and the idea that they may very well be right. To understand where I'm coming from, it's important to go over a little bit of my background. I'm the author of the Look For Me series. That's a series of 12 books which are historically accurate fiction. I take made-up characters and I interject them into real historical events. People will often ask me, where do I get the ideas for the plot points that go within the books? And it's really very simple. I love history. History is very strange stuff. What you're taught in school and what really happened are two different things. I came to the conclusion some time ago that everything we've been taught is a lie. If you keep that in the back of your mind, then as I spell out some of the things that have happened, maybe you'll come to the same conclusion that I have, and that is that we are in World War III. It has been started. This thing is going to get a lot more serious before it gets any better. And the reasoning behind it is not a surprise. Back when I was in high school, I had a friend who volunteered to serve in Vietnam. He became a Marine and shipped out. He used to write us letters, and I put some of his letters in my newspaper. I published a newspaper in high school. I lived in The Hague, Holland. My father worked for the U.S. Embassy in The Hague. He was a military officer, but he worked in the embassy. And the letters came from this classmate of ours for a while, and he talked about Vietnam from a completely different perspective than we were getting on the news. And then his letters stopped coming, and his parents reported to the school that he was killed in action. Talk about something that'll change your perspective when you're a 16, 17, 18-year-old kid. I was 17 at the time. Back then, we had the draft. Now, they weren't drafting people till they were 18, but you had to go sign up for the selective service and get your draft card. People talked about, well, let's go to Vietnam and kill a commie for Christ. And I said, wait a minute. I'm not going to do that. I don't know these people. Why would I want to kill somebody? And you're going to do it for Christ? That kind of blew my mind. I mean, I was fortunate enough when I lived in Holland to attend an Easter service at the Vatican and to see the history of Italy and Rome and well, all over Europe. I was in Boy Scouts, and I got to climb the Swiss Alps. And I was literally in the mountains the day that the Soviet Union rolled into Czechoslovakia. It was in 1968. And I remember our scoutmaster came out and he said, boys, I want you to line up here and look over there. And of course, all we could see was mountains. He said, that's Czechoslovakia over there. There's no line painted on the mountains where you can see the border. It just looks like a bunch of mountains. And he said, while you boys were sleeping, last night the people of Czechoslovakia lost their freedom. And I've never forgotten that. The Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia while we were asleep. He heard it on the BBC, and he told us that. And I remember being a kid living in Holland. We used to listen to Radio Albania and get all kinds of laughs out of it, because they would have this broadcast come on, and they'd play this funky music, and they would say, tonight we begin our broadcast in the English language. We're going to talk about the imperialist American pigs. Well, being Americans, most of us, a lot of my friends were children of diplomats. Their parents were diplomats. But we thought that was a hoot, the imperialist American pigs. What I didn't realize when I was 16, 17, 18 years old is that there was some truth to what was being said by Radio Albania. When our friend was killed in Vietnam, all of us became anti-war protesters. We just didn't understand it. And this was very difficult because some of our parents were in the various branches of the military. My father was an Army colonel. And the last thing you want to do is get that discord going in the family. I know a lot of kids did, but we were in a foreign country and we were taught to respect our elders. I was an Eagle Scout. And so I had this disagreement with myself. Why are we in Vietnam? What is this? And my father was a military officer. So, well, okay, we're participating in all that. As a result of that experience, I started paying attention to war, what causes war, and what the real reasons are behind wars. Now, what causes war in many cases is a false flag. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a false flag used to escalate the war in Vietnam. The sinking of the Maine in 1898 in Havana Harbor was used as an excuse for the United States to go to war and to ultimately destroy Spain's supremacy on the sea. "9/11 was a false flag event used to get America into the Middle East and to blow up Baghdad and Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and to be involved in Libya. Now, I didn't understand at the time what was going on, but I knew, just common sense, that 2 airplanes did not knock down 3 skyscrapers at the World Trade Center, Building 1, Building 2, and Building 7, which is 47 stories tall. If you've never seen those buildings, maybe you could buy into the idea that they could be knocked down. But if you'd ever been to them, I've seen them just once. Those are huge buildings. And this little old aluminum airplane, even though it's powerful and it's loaded with jet fuel, is not going to do it. Everything we've been told is a lie. So why am I concluding that we're now in World War III? And even though this is not a shooting war, it's definitely a war. Well, what I like to tell everybody is you just follow the money, and it's amazing how much you can figure out. So let's do a little bit of history. The United States was created as a result of a revolution against England, and we were rejecting the Bank of England. I don't think they called it that then, but in general, the concept of having a banking outfit that was telling you what to do. And the very first thing that the new United States did is they created a central bank. Lasted for 20 years. And there were vehement arguments about that it was not a good thing. Some said it was, some said it wasn't. But we had a central bank for 20 years. But the charter was allowed to go away. As a result of the disappearance of the Central Bank of the United States back in the early 1800s, we had our single biggest period of prosperity that the United States has ever seen. That was the Industrial Revolution. We survived a civil war. We did not have a central bank. Didn't need one, because economic policies work if you leave them alone. Most people don't spend 5 minutes in a basic economics class. It ought to be required. Money is such a big thing in your life. How come we don't require economics for every high school student? Well, in 1913, a group of bankers got together and created the Federal Reserve, and it was passed into law with the Federal Reserve Act. And the stated purpose of the Federal Reserve, which you can see on their website even today, is that they're going to stabilize the American monetary system, financial system. What people don't realize is that the Federal is not federal and it has no reserves. It's a private banking cartel who came up with a law that required the United States of America to let them set the policy, and consequently the Federal Reserve has been responsible for boom and bust in the United States for over 100 years. There's a lot of history that says that they were responsible for the Great Depression because of their poor handling of the economy. In 1913, you could take $1 and go buy $1's worth of goods. Today, to buy that same amount of goods costs you $23. One of the things the Federal Reserve has in their charter is that they were to prevent inflation. So we've gone from $1 to $23 for the same product. They haven't done a very good job. Well, in the beginning, they were told that they would have to back 40% of their Federal Reserve notes, the currency, with gold. Now, it's interesting, the Federal Reserve doesn't even print the currency. That's done by the Bureau of Engraving, which is under the auspices of the Treasury. The United States has the ability, under its Constitution, to create its own money. It doesn't have to go to the Federal Reserve, but we're strapped in that system. On April 5th, 1933, there was an executive order signed. It's number 6102, signed by Franklin Roosevelt, forbidding the holding of gold and gold certificates. Now, that's weird. Why did they do that? Why did they say that the American people cannot hold gold? Well, the real reason is that the Federal Reserve had printed too many Federal Reserve notes, or authorized the printing thereof. And so they needed to change the game a little bit. So they convinced FDR to go out there and say, hey, we've got to pick up all the gold. Well, the authority that he used was the Enemy Act of 1917 that was created during World War I. And he said, well, we've got to stop the hoarding that's taking place. In 1933, remember the stock market crashed in 1929, and we were hip deep in the Great Depression, which lasted for about 10 years. So FDR told everybody, we've got to stop the hoarding of gold because that's stalling economic growth and it's prolonging the Depression. That was the rationale that was given. But wait a minute, hoarding gold? If I own gold, that's wealth. Can I not have my wealth? So they called it hoarding. Hoarding money? Hello? No, the real reason is that the Federal Reserve needed to change the deal. Now, this new executive order had a penalty of up to $10,000 and up to 5 to 10 years in prison if you were caught holding more than $100 worth of gold. They allowed the American people to hold $100 worth of gold and any collector coin. And so they told the American people, you got to go to the Federal Reserve banks, you turn in your gold, and they will give you $20.67 per ounce. That was the going rate for gold at the time, $20 an ounce. Well, then, the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, this is when the Federal Reserve changed the game. They changed the statutory price of gold from $20.67 an ounce to the very famous $35 an ounce. Now, what that did is that devalued the U.S. dollar. Because on one day, 1 ounce of gold got you $20. On the next day, you had to spend $35 to get that 1 ounce of gold. That was a sneaky trick. And we stayed on the gold standard, $35 gold standard, for a long time. But there's a good reason that we went off of it. Now, when World War II broke out, the United States was neutral for a long time, and they did that on purpose because if you're neutral, man, you can sell guns and ammo and tanks and planes and all kinds of equipment and not risk being bombed by the opposition, the enemy. Now, of course, we were kind of working both sides because we had some of our politicians were doing business with those individuals who were supporting Hitler. That's a whole other story. We were doing the banking for them. But during World War II, prior to 1941, we entered the war in December 7th, 1941. Prior to that, when England or France or anybody else came to the United States saying, hey, we need guns, we need war machinery, we said, fine, we got it. The United States mobilized. We were a manufacturing giant. We were cranking stuff out left and right. And we were happy to sell it to them in exchange for gold. We didn't want their currency. Why don't you want France's currency or England's currency? Well, what if they lose the war? Then the currency's gone. As a side note, remember Abraham Lincoln during the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. He went to the New York bankers and said, "Look, I need to borrow some money to prosecute the war against the Confederate uprising." And the bankers said, "Well, we'll give you some money, but we're going to charge you a whole bunch of interest." And Lincoln said, "Why?" They said, "Because we don't know who's going to win the war." So Lincoln, what he did is he went out and he created the greenback. He just printed his own money, and it worked. It's probably what got him assassinated, because when you challenge the financial system, the banking system, there are forces that will deal with you harshly. So during World War II, we sold a ton of material to the European combatants, and we got gold as payment. There was a thing called the Bretton Woods Agreement. 44 nations sat down, and this was in Bretton Woods, New Jersey, sat down and negotiated how things would be laid out after the war. They met for 22 days in July of 1944. And they created a lot of different things. The most notable is that at the end of the day, they said that the dollar would be the world reserve currency, specifically because it's tied to gold. The price was fixed at $35 an ounce, and that was because of the 1934 Act, which changed it from the previous value. So Bretton Woods lasted for a long time. Now, the advantage to the United States of being the world reserve currency is that it makes exports easier. Hey, everybody will take dollars. Makes imports here easier. You buy stuff with dollars. You sell stuff for dollars. It also makes other currencies less desirable. Now, a lot of currencies, they just peg their value to the American dollar. So if the dollar went up, they went up. If the dollar went down, they went down. So they kind of went together. That's all because the dollar was hooked to the value of gold, $35 an ounce. Well, another advantage to being a world reserve currency that people don't think about is that it makes it easy to export debt. Now, how do you do that? Very simple. You print more money. Sorry, wrong word. Money. It's not money, it's currency. That's a whole other discussion, but there is a difference between money and currency. Currency is like fiat money, which is what we have today. Money is a store of wealth. So gold is a store of wealth. Fiat currencies that we have all over the world are not stores of wealth. Remember, a dollar purchase in 1913, whatever you bought, if you bought that same thing today, is $23. That's currency at work. Well, after World War II and the recovery was underway and the nations in Europe started rebuilding and getting back to normal and manufacturing and so on, they started selling products to the United States in exchange for Federal Reserve notes. Now, at that time, they were called gold certificates or silver certificates. It literally said on the bill that you could take that bill and exchange it for an equivalent amount of gold or silver. So France had worked hard, and by February of 1965, Charles de Gaulle said, "You know what? During the war, we sent a tremendous amount of gold to the United States buying equipment and stuff. We don't have much gold. The United States has all the gold. We've accumulated a bunch of Federal Reserve notes, silver certificates and gold certificates. I want my gold back." And what he did is he sent the Navy, French Navy, to the United States. He turned in a bunch of gold and silver certificates, said, I want my gold. We had no choice. The United States had promised everybody that, yeah, these Federal Reserve notes are backed by gold. Well, when he did that, other countries did that. And all of a sudden, this tremendous amount of gold that the United States had accumulated during World War II was starting to disappear. As a matter of fact, I mean, it's hard to get audits, but Fort Knox reportedly lost about half of its reserves under the leadership of Charles de Gaulle. Well, President Richard Nixon, on August 15th, 1971, came along and said, we're suspending the gold standard. It was known in the financial community as the Nixon shock. He made an announcement. We're temporarily suspending this deal. You can no longer get gold and silver in exchange for Federal Reserve notes. Well, that just stabbed all the rest of the countries right in the back. Well, then Nixon, of course, resigned because of Watergate, and he was replaced by Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford signed a congressional bill that repealed Executive Order 6102. That was signed on December 31st, or went into effect December 31st, 1974. So now Americans can own gold again. As of October 1976, the U.S. dollar was officially no longer linked to gold. When gold was no longer linked to the U.S. dollar, every other currency on the planet was allowed to float. They were no longer pegged to anything that mattered. And so what happened from that point forward is countries around the world just decided to print however much currency they wanted to print. And so we entered a period of tremendous inflation of various currencies and just a wild explosion in debt. Then, in October and November 2000, a man by the name of Saddam Hussein, president of Iraq, he said, you know what? I'm tired of accepting money from the enemy. Actually, it was currency, but he called it money. And he said, I'm not going to sell Iraqi oil for dollars anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sell them for euros. Now, at that time, everybody was exchanging dollars for oil. That was the deal. If you wanted to buy oil, you paid in dollars. It was called the petrodollar. Still is. But Saddam Hussein said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Well, lo and behold, on March 19th, 2003, the United States of America invaded Iraq, looking for weapons of mass destruction that we knew were not there, and blowing up Baghdad in what Donald Rumsfeld called shock and awe. And then on December 30th, 2006, Saddam Hussein was hanged. You know, it's funny, once we invaded Iraq, you could no longer purchase Iraqi oil in euros. You were back having to come up with U.S. dollars in order to purchase that oil. Well, you know, when Saddam Hussein said that he was going to go to euros, Iran said that's a pretty good idea, and so did Syria. As a matter of fact, in 2008, Iran switched, said we're going to accept euros in exchange for our oil. Syria said, well, gosh, if they're going to do it, we're going to do it. And then Muammar Gaddafi of Libya he was in charge of the unified African state, and he proposed a currency with a gold standard, the dinar. He said, we really need to have a currency that's backed by gold. He said that in February of 2009. And on October 20th, 2011, he was killed. So a pattern starts to emerge here. Anybody that challenges the petrodollar or the U.S. dollars, the world reserve currency, they end up at the bottom of a pile of rubble because we've invaded their country. Either we do it overtly like we did Iraq. Of course, we blamed Iraq for 9/11. There's no truth to that whatsoever. We said that they had weapons of mass destruction. No truth to that whatsoever. Complete and total lies. But we managed to get Iraq to start using petrodollars again, didn't we? So now, present day, you got Russia and China. They're trading with each other, exchanging their own currencies, and they're not involving dollars. Russia sells oil, they accept rubles, and they accept gold. They have a de-dollarization agenda. They don't want dollars. And China, ever since they started their rise on the world scene with their manufacturing, their tremendous growth, their year-to-year improvement in their economy, they've been paying very close attention to what we do to the dollar. You know, we buy their goods, we send them dollars. Now think about that. It takes about 3 or 4 cents to print a Federal Reserve note. 3 or 4 cents to print a $100 bill. But to get a $100 bill, other countries, including China, have to provide products or services. What the hell kind of deal is that? These other countries, of course, they're paying very close attention to this. So China has been buying up gold in the last decade or so. They don't have nearly as much gold as they need. And it's always difficult to know how much gold any one country has because they don't report the numbers very well. But the United States, it's estimated the United States has 8,000 tons of gold, metric tons. Russia has about 1,000 metric tons, and China currently has about 3,000 tons. China actually built another vault. They have 4 vaults. Each vault can hold up to about 1,900 tons of gold. And China is not bashful about discussing the concept that there needs to be a Chinese gold-backed currency. And that they're going to make a move to become the world reserve currency in lieu of the dollar. You can't have them both, one or the other. What has happened to everybody that's ever challenged the U.S. dollar in the past? So, in October of 2019, the military Olympic Games were held in Wuhan, China. Now, these are huge, huge games. There were 140 nations that participated. I think close to 10,000 athletes. This is where military people from all over the world get together and participate in sporting events. That was October 2019. You had lots of people coming and going into Wuhan. Well, then, December 2019, the first case of the coronavirus, COVID-19, emerged. By January of 2020, China's starting to shut down. February, March, China's in big trouble. Locking down whole cities, people dying left and right, manufacturing companies shut down. NASA looks at the emissions from satellite to see what activity you have in different countries relative to coal burning. And China's a country that runs on coal. And their emissions from coal is flatlined. They're not producing. Their economy is in big, big trouble because of the coronavirus. Now the coronavirus is spreading all over the world. At last count, it was 121 countries. Hotspots in Europe, U.S., Canada. Well, every continent except for Antarctica has coronavirus. And what's going to be the result of this? The world economy is going to be crippled. And any talk of creating a world reserve currency other than the dollar is squelched. Who comes out on top? So the theory is that a black ops team went to China during the military games, so there was lots of access, in Wuhan, and they just released the coronavirus. Now, why would a black ops group funded by who knows? Maybe they're funded by the United States, maybe they're funded by the global bankers. How would they have access to this virus? Well, there's research to show that the virus was actually developed in the United States. The United States has 13 BSL-4 labs. And we have international treaties that say we're not going to use biowarfare. But it's okay to prepare a defense to biowarfare. So under the guise of defense, countries all over the planet are playing with these dangerous viruses. And independent labs have said that COVID-19 is man-made. The DNA structure shows that it was created, that it has vectors on there that don't happen naturally. They're stitched in. This is a bioweapon. And it started in Wuhan, China. Now, Wuhan, China has a BSL-4 lab. So it could have accidentally gotten out. That would be a cover story. And the other cover story, this is a good one, is that it came from somebody consuming bat soup from the horrendous wet markets that are all over Asia. But there's no proof of that. Now, I find it particularly interesting that in February of 2020, the U.S. Mint issued a quarter in their National Park Series that has 2 bats on the back of it. Now, that quarter was planned a long time ago. But it's funny that it's released in February when they're putting out the cover story that, oh, the coronavirus came from a bat. The people that plan these operations, they don't do it overnight. They plan these things years in advance. My belief is that this is World War III, that those who are trying to protect the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency wanted to put China in its place to prevent China's economic growth and economic prowess. And they have now, as a result of this, been set back probably a decade or more. And China is saying the United States did this. Why would they say that? Unless maybe they know that they didn't do it. It's interesting to note, too, that the Centers for Disease Control on their website, they talk about how Chinese technicians, scientists, have come to the United States and toured biocontainment labs here in this country. It's like, what? We're cooperating? And of course, everybody says, oh, we're trying to prevent Ebola and SARS and coronavirus and so on. And so these are all defensive research efforts. You don't think some guy in some lab somewhere is given the task to take one of these deadly viruses and make it even more deadly? Do you really think that because we have international laws and we have things like the Geneva Convention, do you really think that people don't play with germ warfare, chemical warfare? When it comes to war, it's as dirty as it gets. Now, the question is, why do we get involved in these wars? Well, if you look at history, virtually all, maybe all, wars have been fought for monetary reasons, for financial reasons. As I say in my Look For Me series, there's a passage in there where one of my characters, her name is Margaret, she's been assigned to support General Eisenhower during World War II. She's in Army intelligence, and it's toward the end of the war, and she has just had it. She has seen so much death and destruction that she is about to have a mental breakdown. And so one of the privates drives her out to the bay, and she's just sitting there looking at the water coming in. Sun's going down. She says something to the effect of, "Private, there would be no wars if mothers would not let their sons fight. There would be no wars if mothers would not let their sons fight." I'm Douglas Kirk. This is my theory. I think we've now entered World War III. I think the reason we entered World War III is because China was talking a little bit too much about creating a currency pegged to gold. If they're successful at that, then other currencies are going to rush to that currency and try to get tied to that to stabilize their currency. And that's going to leave no interest in holding the almighty American dollar. Radio Albania. Tonight, we begin our broadcast in the English language. We're going to talk about the imperialist American pigs. That's frightening. There would be no wars if mothers would not let their sons fight.